So if I was going to use compression here to try and fix this thing, I'll just use a glue compressor on this. What I would be hoping to achieve here, the problem with this audio right now is that these lead bits, you can see them popping through even, they're a bunch louder than the rest of the music. So there's a big difference in dynamics. One of the main things a compressor is designed for, compressor affects volume, just volume, that's all. And it's going to help me even out the difference between loud sounds and quiet sounds. The way it does it is it finds the loud sounds and it turns them down in volume. And you choose that with the thresholds. So your main controls are your ratio and your thresholds. These other ones, attack and release, they're kind of fine-tuning, adjusting controls. I'll explain them later. As we lower the threshold, you'll see it start to affect this meter, which is a gain reduction meter. So you can imagine it like, can you still see me while I'm screen sharing? Can you see my video?
I cannot.
Okay, I'll jump back for a second. So I can do some charades. Okay, so imagine there's music going up like this in level, and my other hand here is a threshold. As soon as the music gets louder than this point, the compressor turns it down and stops it. It either turns it down all the way or just a little bit. So, but anything under this threshold, it does nothing. Only until it breaks the threshold will it do something. So we can set the threshold to just affect the loud peaks, and when they come through, we decide how much we want to turn them down. So let's go back to screen share. It's really that simple. It's people get all sorts of...
So how does the ratio work? If the ratio is 1 to 1, it does nothing.
That's true. So the ratio decides...
If it's 2 to 1.
The ratio decides how much we turn it down once it breaks the threshold. And if it's 2 to 1, for every 2 parts that come through, it drops them down to 1. So it's basically halving it. So 4 to 1, I think 4 to 1 is basically quartering it. 8 to 1 would be eight times less. Does that make sense? So if you had a ratio of 2 to 1 like this, and say 10 decibels went through, 10 decibels broke the threshold, it would turn it down to only 5 decibels. If you had 4 to 1 and 10 decibels came through, it would pull it down to 2.5. And if you had it on infinity to 1, it would just turn it all the way down to nothing. Nothing would get through. That's what a limiter actually is. Let me use this compressor too, because this one has more ratio options where it'll go, everything from even subtle things like 1.3 all the way up to infinity. But even when you get to like 8.8 to 1, that's already basically a limiter, because it's turning it down 8 times. It's turning it down so much that you're pretty much using it as a limiter by that point. So some good numbers for your ratio to work with, just day to day, are 2 and 4. That's why they're built in on the glue compressor. There's a really common one, is 2 to 1 for light compression, 4 to 1 for stronger compression, 10 to 1 limiting. That's the best way to think of it. So if I was compressing this, let's start off with a 2 to 1 ratio, and let's lower the threshold until we just get gain reduction on these peaks, but not on the other peaks. So we could even do that we could loop this section and turn down the threshold to it's only just moving. So much more than that. It's already getting a tiny bit there. Let's bring up the attack a bit. So much more. So hopefully now it should just go on these peaks which are coming through here. Maybe we go 4 to 1 so we can get a little bit more dramatic on those changes. See, now you can see it's just moving the needle when these spikes are coming through. So we're controlling the volume of those a little. If I turn it off, you'll hear it much more dynamic. But let's try maybe on something, different piece of audio, something a good example. I think probably one of the best examples to demo a compressor on is vocals or drums. That's where it's the most obviously heard. So let's try vocal 1, pull in.
Oh, and on the vocals in the track, you mentioned they were quiet at the beginning. Did you feel that way throughout the song?
Some sections they felt okay. Did you have automation on the volume?
I didn't. So the vocal, so I felt kind of that way too, but I didn't want to automate the vocal volume at all.
You absolutely should. It's one of the great things and key things for a great balanced mixdown is to automate the vocal in sections to make it appropriate for that section. Excuse me.
It seemed weird, like seemed the quietest at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's when there's actually the song's the quiet itself. So it didn't really make any sense. I think it's probably because that piano is pan center and so is the vocal.
Yeah, it could be. Whatever section though, if the vocal feels too quiet, you absolutely should turn it up for that section. And if it feels too loud in another section, turn it down. You want it to stay pretty similar throughout the song. Like you should only be changing this a couple of decibels, maybe 3 or so.
Yeah.
But don't feel like you have to keep the vocal at the same volume all the way through. It's something that happens a lot in pop production is they definitely do automate the vocal volume to match the emotion and volume of each section.
Okay. I'll definitely do that.
Okay. So let's look at some compression on some different vocals here.
Just make a way to.
Let's see if I get something nice and dynamic.
Baby, you better
Yeah. Okay, this piece here.
Is it true? Tell me.
You really hear how loud that section is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we take some glue compression on this, I'll just leave the attack and release on default, just 12 o'clock for now. Lower the threshold till we get a little bit of movement.
Is it true? Tell me. Is it true? Tell me. Is it true?
So again, you're seeing the gain reduction meter really just spiking on the louder sounds and not so much on the quieter sounds. You kind of want it so that when it's on the quieter sounds of whatever you're working on, it should be close to 0, maybe with just a tiny bit of movement.
Yeah.
So that way you can get a good contrast. Then we could decide how much ratio we want, if we want a 2:1 or 4:1. Actually, maybe even before that, what you should do is, once you've got a good amount of gain reduction going, look at how much it is.
Is it true? Tell me.
Looks like about 5 dB of gain reduction for the most. So you should match your makeup gain output to the same. Put in 5. And with compressors, one of the best tricks for it is to make sure it's at what we call unity gain, which means when we turn it on or off, it feels like it's the same volume. So let's try that.
Is it true? Tell me.
A good way to test that is in the louder sections.
Tell me. Tell me. Tell me. Tell me.
Maybe I'll get a tiny bit.
Is it true? Tell me. Is it true?
The reason we do that is otherwise it would just make everything quieter. Because a compressor's job really is it does just make things quieter. It takes loud sounds and turns them down. So by turning it back up afterwards, it's as if we've turned this section down and then we've raised the whole volume back up again. So in effect, what we've really done is made the quieter sounds louder. We haven't actually made the louder sounds quieter. In a roundabout way we have. We made these quieter, then raise the whole volume. And what we've done is raise the average volume. So if I made a new track here, I'll show you with audio, and we'll go resampling, and I'll record back in what we've actually done here.
me, is it true? Tell me, this me.
Let me have a look at this one. Look how much more even this is compared to that. Volume about the same. Like this has come up a bit louder. This has gone down a bit. We could exaggerate.
Yeah.
We could exaggerate that more by putting this on 4:1.
Me, is it true? Tell me, this me, is it true? Tell me, this me, is it true? Tell me,
And we'll record this one in.
me, is it true? Tell me, this me.
Again, now it's starting to look a much more controlled dynamic there compared to this one. So this is the number one reason you generally use compressors, is to control the dynamic range, to fix sections where it's too quiet in one bit and too loud in another bit. It evens it out. Then the attack and the release controls, they just change. They change the way it responds when it's triggered. So, like I said, compressors are triggered by volume. When the volume becomes loud enough and breaks the threshold, it turns down the volume by the ratio you've set, by that amount. You can think of ratio as the amount of compression. Then the attack is going to say, how long will it take until I turn down the volume? Is it going to be immediate, or should I wait a little bit? If you have it on a fast one, like a smaller number over here, it's going to be close to immediate. It can never be exactly immediate because it has to wait a second to hear it to turn it down, but it'll be close. So that's 0.1 milliseconds, 0.1 milliseconds, 0.3, 1 millisecond, 3 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, and 30 milliseconds. A release is on the tail end. It's saying after the sound has fallen below the threshold, or after it's been triggered, how long will it take till the level of the volume returns to normal? Because the sound breaks the threshold, it gets turned down a certain amount, and if the release was very quick, it would immediately snap back to its regular volume. If the release was slow, it would stay there for a second and slowly restore itself back to the regular volume. A good way to think about these two knobs is, if you have the attack on a very fast, immediate setting, it's going to grab these transients really quickly and it's going to soften them. So a fast attack generally will soften the attacks of your audio. So if you're using it on drums and you wanted to soften the attack, you would use a fast attack. If you wanted it to let the original attack come through and retain the original snap and punch, you would use a slow attack. And it's not necessarily always best to put it on the slowest possible. Somewhere just between medium and slow, you'll find an optimal setting there. With the ratio, a faster ratio where it returns to normal quickly will sound very obvious. You'll hear the compressor kind of pumping and moving, and it sounds kind of exciting in a way. It doesn't sound realistic, but it sounds exciting. So that's great for dance music because we're not about realistic. We're just about exciting. On the other side of the spectrum, the slower ones will sound more transparent. They'll sound like you won't really notice the compressor as much because it'll be super smooth and slow. They can be good in situations where you don't want people to notice that you're compressing something. You want it to be subtle and kind of secret. That's when you want to use a slower release. So think of release as slow release is for transparent, subtle kind of compression, where you want it to sound hidden, and fast release for exciting, pumping, almost effect-based compression, which is generally what you use the most in dance music. So a really common setting would be something like a medium slow attack and a medium fast release would be sort of your go-to setting for almost everything in dance music, really, and you would just adjust it from there. A great way to set it up, though, when you're dialing in something, let's pull in a drum loop, and I'll show you the order of how you should set up your compressor and how you should dial in a sound, I suppose. It makes it all really easy. So let's grab a drum loop that's not very compressed. I think I've got some classic loops here. get that on preview. Try and find a really good example. Yeah, maybe that one. Want something with a whole bunch of dynamics in it. Yeah, that's pretty dynamic. Between the kicks, the snares, the hats and everything, big difference in volume. I'll just take it off warp. Okay, so if you're just loading up a compressor for the first time and you're wondering what setting you're going to start it on to figure out how you can compress this and get a nice sound, this is what you should do. Put your attack on as fast as possible. Put your release on as fast as possible. Put your ratio on as high as possible. And you do this because it's going to exaggerate, all of these things exaggerate the compression. That way when you're dialing in the setting, it's really obvious the compression sound, and it's really easy to choose your attack and release times, and then you just back it off afterwards. So full ratio, highest you can go, fast release, fast attack.
You just cut out there for like 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Where did I leave off? What did you miss?
Right at the start of what settings to start with.
Oh, okay. So let's do that again.
Yeah.
So you want to start off your compression settings when you're about to load one up on any track and you're trying to figure out what setting you're going to use. Start with the fastest attack possible, fastest release possible, and the ratio on the highest as possible. All of these things will exaggerate the compression the most, which is going to make it easier to hear the compression so that you can dial in the most accurate settings first. Otherwise it sounds too subtle and it's too hard to hear. So once you've done those, start lowering your thresholds from the top. This would be the top because it's 0. Lowering your threshold down until you start getting some movement on the gain reduction meter and start getting some compression. Once you got a little compression there, then we can dial in our settings. Okay, let's give it a go. So we can see the meter moving now. We're getting some compression. You notice it's turning down the volume, right? If I keep going, it's just going to turn the volume down even more. Because that's what a compressor does, turns down the volume. And we just control how it turns down the volume, and that's what gives us these creative results. So let's set something reasonable. Start with, say, 5 to 10 dB of gain reduction is probably a good starting point. For like an instrument anyway. If you're using this on your master bus, you'd probably only want 1 to 3 dB of gain reduction. But let's go for 5 to 10. Okay, once you've got that set, now we decide what our attack and release times should be, and then afterwards we can decide our ratio. So let's start with the attack, and we're going to slowly increase our attack. And it's going to go from, when it's fast right now, the compressor is going to be gripping, it's going to be obvious, and it's going to be softening sounds. As we increase the time on it, it's going to let the transients poke through before the compressor kicks in, and you're going to hear a bit more attack on the sounds. So this is a point where you decide, how much attack do I want my sounds to have? And we find the best spot. So as I take it to the right, I'll give you a full example. We'll go straight from one side to the other. This would be the fastest, which is the softest attack. And then if we went the other side, which is the slowest and let most attack, big difference, right?
Yeah.
So let's try and find the optimal point. I feel like when it's all the way over to the right, it lets so much through that it's almost like it's not really compressing. So I'd probably go more like 3 or 10. Yeah, maybe 3 or 10. We might come back to that when we're fine-tuning it. Then with your release, we're on the fastest one, so it's pumping quickly. If I had this super slow when it's more transparent, that's on 1.2. It's going to take a long time to return the volume to normal. It's going to just pin the volume down. When it's quick like this, the compressor is going to trigger on this note, pulls the volume down, and it's going to rise up again in time for the next one, or in time for the snare. But if I have the volume pinned down for so long with a slow release, it'll never rise up again, and we'll never get our attacks. So look, when I put it on 0.1 or 1.2, the slower one, one will let the attacks come through, the other one's just going to pin it down, and we won't get this movement anymore. It'll just feel like the volume's just turned down. So let's put that on slow. Don't really hear much movement. We go to the 0.1, back to the fast one. You hear a bit more movement going on there now. So when you're using it on drums and most things, you're usually trying to get your release fast enough so that after the compression, it will return back to normal in time for the next loud sound to compress that properly as well. So you're kind of setting your release in time with the music. For most stuff, you usually want a relatively fast release. And especially in dance music, again, because like I said, we want stuff to sound exciting. And if you wanted it sounding a little more subtle, you might slow down the release. Usually on things like vocals and stuff, if you wanted the compression to sound more subtle, you might use a slower release. But I think in this case, we'll go with either the fastest or the second fastest. Yeah, let's go the fastest. Okay, so now we've got our attack set, our release set, and it was easy to hear because our compression was exaggerated. Now we can lower the amount because we only cranked this up to the top just so it was over the top, exaggerated. Now let's try it back on a normal setting, something more realistic like 2 or 4, because remember 10 is basically limiting. So 2 or 4 are some good options for just normal day-to-day compression. Two seems like enough. I think we could probably even lower our threshold back down now too, so maybe it's only hitting something like 5 dB. And again, final tip, most important thing, make sure you use your makeup gain to match your output so that when you turn this on and off, it should be exactly the same volume, what we call unity gain. What comes in, comes out the same. So I'm getting...
Don't some compressors have auto makeup gain?
That's true. That's true. Good point. Some compressors do have auto makeup gain, but be careful with those because they're not always very accurate. The way to test is try the auto makeup gain, bypass your compressor, turn it on again.
See if it,
see if it actually does sound like the same volume, because otherwise sometimes the auto makeup gain makes it a little louder than it should be, and it might fool you into thinking it's better, because we always tend to gravitate towards louder, and we think louder is better.
Yep.
So even now, I know I'm getting 5 dB of gain reduction. I'm just guessing and adding 5 for my makeup gain, but often I find that that's too much, and I have to drop it by a dB or half a dB. Let's have a listen.
Yeah.
I think in this case it's pretty on. Yeah. So now I can hear the compressor just lightly gripping because I'm on the 3, not the 10. Ripping back nice and fast, get some nice pull with the fast release there. It's giving it a little bit of groove and pump in that loop there and evening out some of the dynamics. Some nice snap on the snare too. With this compressor too, sometimes it's nice to just try out the soft clip as well. On the output, it's like a little soft limiter. Yeah, it really feels like it's pulling all these sounds to the front with each hit and keeping them to an even volume now. You hear that coming through?
Yeah.
Does that sound good, man? Does that explain a bit for you about how compressors work and how they should be set up?
Yeah, definitely. That's helpful.
Awesome.
I'll have to mess around with that.
Does it give you any questions as well?
Let's see. So, I guess it's probably always a good idea to throw a compressor on the drum, on your drums. Is that really true?
Pretty much, at least on your drum group, just to even out the slight volume differences between your different types of percussion. If you're doing any kind of house-based music with a 4/4 kick drum, I tend to prefer to keep the kick drum out of the drum group because otherwise it'll drive the compressor too much. So I'd have my kick separate, and then I'd have all my other drums in one group. So hi-hats, snares, claps, congas, toms, all that sort of stuff, all in one group. And I would have a compression setting on it very similar to this. Very, very similar. Probably even the same kind of amount, about 5 dB. And that will help glue them all together. That's where this term glue comes from, I guess, because you're evening out the volumes. It makes them feel like they're all coming from the one place rather than feeling so separated and loose and weak. It makes them feel stronger. So it's a great idea. This kind of setting on your drum group, everything except the kick. Sometimes I would put the kick in too, but it would only be if it's a smaller, lighter kick drum, not like a house kick drum, which is a big, heavy kick drum. A smaller, lighter kick drum might be used sometimes in dubstep because they have sort of more punchy kick drums, which aren't as bassy because you're leaving room for the sub. Drum and bass, drum and bass, I'd keep the kick drum in. What other genres? If it was more funk, rock and roll, I'm forgetting something else too. But essentially anything where you don't have a big, super boomy kick drum, then you can try including, breakbeat as well. Otherwise, if it's house style, keep the kick separate. But that makes sense?
Yeah,